Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
And welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. With the nation's unemployment at 8.9%, the highest it's been in over 25 years, workers across the country are fighting in a variety of ways to keep their jobs. Nearly 1,000 workers at the Chicago-based apparel firm Hart, Schaffner & Marks, or Hart Marks, recently voted to sit in to save their jobs in an effort to prevent Wells Fargo from liquidating the factory. In December, at the Republic Windows and Door factory in Chicago, workers occupied the factory floor after the plant's owners gave employees just 3 days' notice of the plant's closure. The workers ended their 6-day occupation after winning a settlement securing the reopening of the plant under new management.
Later in the show, we'll be joined by Armando Robles, a union leader and maintenance worker at the former Republic Windows and Doors factory. But first, we turn to journalists Naomi Klein and Avi Lewis. In 2004, they produced the documentary The Take about workers in Argentina taking over the factories abandoned by their owners. Naomi's author of a number of books, including The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, and No Logo. Avi Lewis is the host of the news show Fault Lines on Al Jazeera English. They're speaking tonight at Cooper Union here in New York at an event called Fire the Boss, the Worker Control Solution from Buenos Aires to Chicago. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Naomi, before we go into these various takeovers from Argentina to Chicago, your comment on the latest situation with the banks. We haven't seen you since, well, soon after the various bailouts.
And they're ongoing. I mean, I wish things had gotten better since we last spoke. And I think I called the bank bailout the biggest heist in monetary history back then, and it's just gotten bigger. We've seen just an absolutely unprecedented transfer of public wealth into private hands. And, you know, what I've been saying from the beginning, I think it's becoming even clearer now, which is that the crisis in the financial sector is not being solved, it's being moved. A private sector crisis is being transformed into a public sector crisis in the sense of the huge deficit that's being left behind because of this bailout, which isn't even doing what it's supposed to be doing in terms of restoring credit and fixing the real economy. So the price of this is, if it isn't fixed, is going to be paid in cutbacks to health care, to Social Security. We haven't felt the full shock yet. And that's my concern. Yes, I'm concerned about what's going on now, but I'm concerned about how this transfer of wealth is going to be paid for down the road in terms of the meager social services that Americans get in exchange for their tax dollars.
And yet you're seeing now, at least in the stock market, the bank stocks, as well as some of the others, are at least leveling off, or beginning to rise again, even as unemployment continues at record levels, and new people that are thrown out into the street every month.
You know, and during the election campaign, you know, I think what Obama articulated so well is the fact that people realize that what's good for Wall Street isn't necessarily good for Main Street. And he said, you know, we've had this top-down approach, giving more and more to the people at the top, waiting for it to trickle down. And he promised that that would change. Quite the contrary. What's actually happened is that homes, jobs have been sacrificed in order to stabilize the financial sector. So what I'm really worried about is that what we're seeing, if this quote-unquote works, and of course that's up for debate, and we have some very respected economists like Joseph Stiglitz and Paul Krugman who have, you know, said very clearly that they don't even think this is going to save the financial sector, that we haven't even addressed the depth of that crisis because we don't even know the extent of the toxic debts. But even if it does work, you know, even if we suspend disbelief and believe that it does work, what I'm worried about is that this is the new normal, that the banks are being saved on the backs of union workers, on the backs of what's left of the manufacturing sector, on the backs of homeowners. And so what becomes the new normal after the crisis is an even more deeply divided country, an even more deindustrialized country. And that's why we're highlighting tonight in this event that we're doing at Cooper Union and bringing in workers who are on the front lines of this struggle to tell their stories of how they're trying to save their workplaces, is that, you know, we need to address this now because we don't want this to be the new normal.
It seems I wanted to ask you, because you seem to be focusing more on how workers and ordinary Americans can respond themselves. But we've seen, for instance, the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, launched this huge corporate campaign against Bank of America to get the union and citizen groups to get involved in trying a shareholder revolt to remove Klein Lewis. And I reported to the Daily News that SEIU, while it was doing that, was also increasing the amount of money it personally, the union, was borrowing from Bank of America. Yeah. But this effort to direct the struggle towards shareholder actions rather than actual grassroots organizing in these communities.
Well, you know, that's why I think that the case of the Republic Windows and Doors factory is so interesting, and you know, looking forward to hearing from Armando later in the show, is that I think it is really important for the labor movement to talk about the injustice of the bailout, to do a huge amount of popular education. But for me, it's less about changing the CEO at the top and more about highlighting the incredible double standards. And that was why the Republic Windows and Doors occupation became not just a national symbol, but an international symbol, because the workers in that factory, with their union leadership at UE, which is a smaller, very democratic union, decided that they were not just going to highlight the actions of their bosses, the owners of their factory, but the actions of Bank of America in the fact that they had gotten bailout money and that they had refused a line of credit. So here you had, the country in an outraged over the fact that so much taxpayer money had gone to these banks in the name of increasing credit, and then they're finding out that the banks aren't actually lending. But here you have this very concrete case where the banks didn't lend to a workplace that needed it. The workers were paying the price. And so here you had this sort of injustice, the double standards of the bailout, and their slogan, "You got bailed out, we got sold out," in microcosm. So I think that, to me, that is a much more a better use of the targeting of the banks than changing going after the CEOs at the top, because I think we have this illusion that when you change the CEO, then something deep is happening, and that becomes almost synonymous with re-regulation, which is what we really need in the financial sector. And if we think back to the 30s, in FDR's first 100 days, he got Glass-Steagall passed. We've seen no serious re-regulation of the financial sector. And so when we just focus on changing the leadership and that kind of shareholder activism, I think we have the illusion that there is a sort of a real re-regulation going on in the financial sector, and it's just not happening. And that's what we need the labor movement to be saying.
Well, before we go to Chicago and Argentina, Avi Lewis, I did want to ask you about, the industry that isn't getting quite as much as the banks. That's the auto industry, and you're just back from Detroit. Chrysler announcing plans to close, nearly 800 dealerships, a quarter of its retail chain. General Motors is expected to follow suit today with closing 1,000 dealerships. Taken together, it could mean something like 90,000 workers will lose their jobs.
Well, I just spent a week in Detroit doing the latest episode of Fault Lines on the auto crisis and the way it's being experienced on the ground by workers in where the auto sector used to have its home. What's fascinating about what I learned that is not being talked about right now has to do with the financialization of the auto sector and of all American corporations, and the way that is now taking a real hit out on working people. So you have, in the stress tests, remember one of the biggest insolvencies that was revealed was the financing arm of GMAC, which has an $11 billion hole in its balance sheet, which the public is going to backstop, which we're going to pay for, because, and this is what's not being told, GM, the credit arm and the Ford credit arm in different degrees, and Chrysler's too, were gambling in derivatives because there were super profits to be made when the bubble was being inflated. We have a lack of productive investment in the auto sector, which has been going on for 3 decades, while they've been financializing. So you see immediately the Treasury Department is prepared to bail out the financial arm of GM, while GM and Chrysler are both being forced into bankruptcy. So not only do you have the financialization of the sector and the bailouts for the financial arms, which dwarf the others, you also have the logic of the vulture capitalist at work in the auto sector. Why are they being driven into bankruptcy? Why is there such a rush to go into the bankruptcy process? I interviewed Ralph Nader, who's been following the auto industry for a little while now, and he said that basically it's about driving, it's speculative capitalist logic to drive the companies down, to squeeze what can be squeezed. Unemployment and layoffs always rise a stock price to cash out on the bounce back. If you look at the auto industry task force that President Obama has appointed, there's no one from the auto sector there. Most of them are investment bankers, and they're looking at this as a classic corporate restructuring where you're focused on the share price, where you're focused on the bounce back, where you're getting billions of dollars of public money. Jobs are just simply not the focus there. So the auto industry is subject to some of the same special treatment when it comes to the financing arms, but to a very different standard when you're talking about the actual workers. And so that's why we've seen worker occupations in the auto sector too. In Canada, there have been 4 plant occupations in the last 4 months, I think. All of them plants that were closed suddenly and abruptly without the proper notification, severance packages which are up in the air, maybe drifting away, and workers leaping to their feet in this moment and saying, wait a second, there's trillions of dollars of public money which is being funneled to certain kinds of businesses. Where's our bailout? That's a powerful call.
But yet, some of the Republican critique